Thank you everyone who's in attendance in person and also on Zoom. I'd like to thank the Russell Museum for hosting me today. It's very generous of you. Today, our subject is St. Thomas Aquinas, his life and his philosophy. So the title of this talk is Non Nicete Domine. Now, if you don't know Latin, if you're not familiar with this phrase, what I'd like you to try to do is guess what this might mean by the time we reach the end of the talk. So he wrote about 8 million words with his many volumes that he wrote. And of all the words that he ever wrote, Non Nicete Domine is what he's famous for. Non Nicete Domine is what shaped who he was and how he approached subjects of philosophy, theology, and how to interact in the world. So today we're going to be covering a number of different topics. First, we're going to talk a little bit about who St. Thomas Aquinas was. That will be his least favorite section. If he was watching, if he was zooming in, he would not like that I included that. Of all philosophers I know of, he probably wrote the least about himself. And of all people that I know of, he was probably one of the most humble about his accomplishments, which were prodigious. Next, we're going to talk about some philosophical concepts. What did he accept? What shaped his understanding? And finally, we can't get away from Aquinas without talking about his famous 5 ways. So these were his 5 proofs of the existence of God. He referred to these as the monoduxia, or the leading by the hand. So although they appear to be kind of technical, Aquinas didn't think they were. He wrote these as summaries at the beginning of his Summa Theologiae, and he intended this to be for beginners. He expounds upon them later in the Summa Contra Gentiles and other works, but what we're going to be dealing with are his summaries, and in fact, worse than that, my summaries of his summaries, just to really pare it down. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how did Aquinas understand the universe, his place in it, and our place in it, in light of his philosophical concepts and in light of his understanding of God. So as for his early life, he was born in 1224. He was born to a pretty wealthy family. His brothers were all in the military. His uncle was the abbot of Monte Cassino, which is pictured here as a Benedictine monastery and probably the most important monastery in all of Christendom at the time. So his family wanted him to eventually succeed his uncle and become the abbot, because being the abbot of this monastery was the fast track to becoming pope. And in the years which he was about, that was probably not just the most important job in his nation, not just in all of Christendom, not just in all of Europe, but possibly the most powerful and most influential position in the world. So that's the track that he was initially on. At 5 years old, he asked one of his teachers, "What is God?" And that seemingly simple question gave that teacher pause. He couldn't quite explain it. So young 5-year-old Aquinas decided that he would begin to study philosophy and theology to find out. So that brings him to the University of Naples, again, one of the most famous universities of the time. And his teacher was St. Albert the Great, who assumably earned that title and would have been one of the most, if not the most famous philosophers at the time if it wasn't for his famous student Aquinas. So in those classes, the other students, as students do, like to try to impress their professor, like to try to impress the other students, and would call out answers and give great monologues and whatnot. But Aquinas didn't. He was not one to self-promote. He was not one to try to impress others. Instead, he would stay silent most of the time. So the other students thought that maybe he was a little bit slow. Maybe he wasn't catching on like they were. So they decided they would help young Aquinas. So after the lessons, they would say, hey, Aquinas, maybe we can go over this with you. Can you explain this? And of course he could. Well, can you explain that too, Aquinas? And he could. Well, actually, we were wondering about some things, Aquinas. Could you explain this too? And he always could. So not before he eventually got the title the dumb ox from his students, probably the meaner of the bunch. But Albert the Great actually ended up changing that. He said, well, you guys call him the dumb ox, but I say that throughout the centuries, people will hear this ox is bellowing. And that is exactly what we're hearing and what we're hearing today. We're hearing his bellowing still coming out throughout the centuries as his philosophy and theology is one of the most preeminent in all of the Western world. A few stories about Aquinas. He was once receiving a surgery, and as he was being cut open, He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he didn't even wince. Strangely, he seemed to be completely unaffected. He didn't even seem to notice. So that's just another sign of how he was completely outward focused. He wasn't thinking about the things going on inside. He wasn't concerned about his life, his comfort, things like that. He wasn't. He was entirely looking outside of himself. Now, oftentimes he was sent place to place and he was given a donkey. It was like the equivalent in the 1200s of like being given like a I don't know, a Nissan Versa rental car to get place to place. It was a pretty humble means of transport, no offense to Nissan owners. But he refused to ride it because he would rather walk himself. He'd rather carry his own possessions than impose on the donkey. Again, that's how other-centric he was. And for this reason, he was attracted to the Dominicans. The Dominicans were a new mendicant order or begging order that had been established by St. Dominic about 100 years prior. So what they would do, in opposition to what a lot of other monks would do, is they would go into the cities, they would preach. They were a preaching order. They wouldn't rely on their large country estates. They wouldn't rely on different jobs they did. They would just rely on what people would give them for their food, what people would give them to support their lodging and their work. And this attracted young Thomas Aquinas, and he decided that he would join, much to the chagrin of his family. Because again, they had an uncle who was the abbot of the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, and they wanted him to be pope. So en route to Rome with the Dominicans, his brothers laid a trap, ambushed him, captured him, and drug him back to here, which, if you ever get imprisoned, I do advise finding a place with such beautiful views. Nevertheless, he spent about a year being trapped by his own family in the family castle. Now, to try to derail his plans to become a Dominican, his brothers decided to hire a prostitute and put her into his room to tempt him. Young Aquinas gets a fire poker and drives her out. And eventually, this whole situation gets pretty embarrassing for the family. After all, they wanted Aquinas to be somebody that they could proudly say, oh, he's the abbot, oh, he's the pope or something like that. But no, he wants to go and become a beggar. But it was even worse when people would say at dinner parties, young Thomas, how is he? Oh, we imprisoned him in the castle. There was a prostitute incident. And anyways, he still wants to be a beggar. So eventually they left a window open so that he could escape. And Thomas, who was called the dumb ox, not just because he was quiet and people presumed he was stupid before he very much proved them incorrect, but also because he was also a kind of portly fellow, he waddled over to the window and somehow got his frame out. He escaped and he joined the Dominicans. Now, of all philosophers and theologians, he of all seems to draw from any and every tradition that he can possibly get his hands on their works. For instance, he draws from scripture, Old and New Testaments. That's probably what he quotes the most, but he also quotes the church fathers, and not just any church fathers, but also people like Origen, who were later viewed some of his later works as heretical. He sifts through what's true and he spits out what is false. Greek philosophy is no different. He's a student of Aristotle, but he also pulls from Neoplatonic thought, from Stoic philosophy, again, pulling everything that is good out of those traditions and synthesizing it into one totalizing worldview. And finally, even Islamic philosophers, for instance, Avicenna, who inspires his third way that we'll get to shortly. He draws from him, he draws from Averroes, who he refers to as the commentator, the commentator on Aristotle, that is, and he pulls from him and quotes him, even though he ends up having a feud with the people who accept Averroes' interpretation of the newly interpreted works of Aristotle that came in some period of time before Thomas Aquinas. They were new in his day. And finally, he even pulls from Jewish scholars. For instance, Maimonides, who is about 100 years prior living in Spain. He's not afraid to pull from every single source that he sees truth in. So Aquinas is known for his philosophy, draws from many traditions, but he's also known for being what's called the Masterio Sacropagio, the master of the sacred page, where what he's probably spent the most time in was actually teaching scripture. That's not all he did, though. They also sent him from libraries to libraries because when he arrived at a library, he could read different books and commit them almost entirely to memory so that when he arrived, he could write those out and give those books to others. He was a master of multitasking. Famously, he could work on multiple different works at once. He could be in prayer with 4 scribes, dictate some to one, some to another, some to the next, and some to the last one. And they could all be writing, and he could be going back and forth, writing on more than one topic while in prayer, all at the same time. Finally, he's a master of mysticism, where although he tackles some extraordinarily difficult questions and difficult topics to explain, he doesn't just consult the works of Aristotle or all the other people that we mentioned, but at the end of the day, when Aquinas is stumped, he goes into the chapel, up to the altar, he puts his head on the altar, and he asks God to somehow let him see the truth. Finally, he's a master of music. So many of the hymns that are sung today in Catholic churches were actually written by Thomas Aquinas. Now, if you guys know much about academics in general, you know that they have one fear above all. That's looking stupid. And worse yet, looking like they don't know what they're talking about in front of people who are, the common ones. Maybe another philosophy professor could come and challenge them and they could accept that this was a good critique. But the idea of just letting all comers come before you and pelt you with questions opens you up to ridicule, opens you up to humiliation. But again, Aquinas does not care about this. He's content to be viewed as the dumb ox. He's not interested in self-promotion. So this is one of his very favorite things to do, is to go in front of everybody that could possibly arrive in an amphitheater and say, all right, guys, hit me, questions, go. And this is where he developed one of his most famous works called The Disputed Questions, which are kind of the best questions that people ever posed to him, and then his answers. Now, famously, he was at a banquet with King Louis IX, and in the midst of it, instead of hobnobbing with the king and all the nobles, all the fancy people of the time, trying to kind of get his in with wealth, power, pleasure, honor. Now, again, Aquinas does not care about those things. So in the middle of the banquet, he slams his pudgy hand on the table and says, that will settle the Manichaeans. Because he was thinking the entire time about truth, about how to dispel falsehood, about how to answer the difficult questions. That's what he was wrapped up in when everybody else was wrapped up in the banquet. Also, he cares much more about truth than almost anything else. So the Kalam and the cosmological and the ontological argument were both very hot topics at the time. So a couple years prior, St. Anselm comes up with the ontological argument, and it's an argument for the existence of God. Now, it got everybody very excited, except for Thomas Aquinas. Now the pressure was to accept this and say, oh, look, he did it, but he just didn't think it passed the test. So he rejected that one. Also, the Kalam cosmological argument, Kalam coming from Islamic philosophy, it's one that you probably recognize. It's popularized by primarily Protestant philosophers and theologians. It goes, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause, and then they unpack what that cause would have to be. Now, Aquinas actually rejects this, not because of the first premise. Of course, anything that begins to exist must have a cause. That one is pretty obvious, and he'll show why. But it's the second one. He doesn't think that we can prove by reason alone that the universe began to exist. He believes that according to sacred scripture, but he doesn't think that we can prove that just with reason. Some contemporaries disagree with that, but again, it doesn't quite meet his standards. So he's happy to reject that. He's happy to reject the ontological argument, even though there's probably a lot of pressure to accept those. Another story about Thomas Aquinas, about 100, 200 years prior, there was the Great Schisms, so the breaking of the Eastern and Western Catholic churches. Now, he was sent to help heal the divide at this big council. He's on his way, and everybody has a lot of hope in him because, again, he's a pretty smart guy. He can bring clarity where there is confusion in ways which few people can follow. And yet, he gets sick on the way out. He ends up being nursed by a bunch of nuns, and the nuns realize on his deathbed, they have Thomas Aquinas after all. I mean, we're not going to lose this opportunity. So they say, hey, Aquinas, you know how there's not much to do with the deathbed and all? Could you just write a commentary on one of the books of the Bible? Well, you just have nothing else to do. And Aquinas, always, even on his deathbed, other-focused, caring about truth, says, well, sure, of course. And from memory, because he memorized most all of the Bible, he gives his commentary verse by verse on the Song of Songs. Okay, we're done with Aquinas' least favorite section. He would not be happy that we've wasted so much time on him. Instead, we're going to jump into metaphysics. We're going to cover a couple concepts here, and that's going to be the setup for his famous 5 ways. And after that, we'll move on to what kind of implications those things have. Now, here is a bridge. Now, I ask you, why is there this bridge? Well, you could answer the stone. The bridge is there because of the stone. Or maybe if it was concrete, bridge is there because of the concrete. That's true. Another way you could say is, well, the construction company, the stonemasons, right? It's there because of the construction company. That's true. That would be the efficient cause. The next is, why is the bridge there? Well, you could say, well, the form of the bridge, right? Because the construction company came to the job saying, I have an idea about what this bridge will become, and I'm going to take this, what will it become, and cause it to become a concrete reality. So this would be the idea in the mind of the engineer or the architect. It's this form. So why is there a bridge? Well, the form of the bridge. Okay, one more question. Why is there a bridge here? Well, that one brings us to the final cause, the reason for the form being like this and not like that. And the reason that the form of the bridge is like this is so that something can cross from one side to another. There's a certain power that comes out of the form being like this, bridgely, if you will, such that something can cross from one side to another. So Aquinas would accept that things have each one of these causes. Now, commonly you hear the last 2 left off, and modern science typically focuses just on the material and the efficient, but Aquinas would say that's a big mistake and that you lose a massive amount of reality when you do such things. And of course, we'll get to that too. Hylomorphism. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, that bridge was a composite. It was both material, yes, but it was also the form. If it was just material, then it'd just be a blob of concrete or a pile of rocks, but it was given form by its efficient cause. So here's the statue of David. If I was to say, can you point to the material of the David? Go, oh, it's right here. If I said, could you point to where the form of the David is? You'd go, also right here. The form subsists in the thing such that this becomes a statue of David. So whenever a form comes to occupy matter, if it's what's called a substantial form, it creates a substance. For instance, if we have hydrogen and oxygen and they combine, it creates water. Now, we know that it's a substantial form because it has causal powers, which are irreducible to its parts. For instance, water has the power to quench thirst, but that's not a property of either hydrogen or oxygen. Now, it's true that these 2 components are necessary to make up water, and that's exactly what Aquinas would say, but he'd say that this basic material has taken on a new form, and therefore it's expressed in new causal powers. Now, Aquinas would say that the word for a living form would be a soul. So although it's just a form, if we have the form of water, if we have a cat, it has a soul, which is a living form. It's a principle of unity for a living thing. And don't worry, we'll talk much more about souls after this. So the reason why this is very important is it opposes strict materialism, because if you're just a materialist, he would argue that there's a causal power regress problem. And let me explain. Imagine that we have a little goat, and the goat looks out with his little goat eyes, and he sees a particularly juicy patch of grass. So now the goat has an intention to go and eat that grass. Well, first off, we would say that intention is not a property of matter, but it is a property of goats according to its form. Now, a materialist might say, well, no, we can't say that this new novel power of intention is in the goat as a whole. We would have to say it's in its parts. But here lies the rub. Well, if it's in just this part or that part, then you're just reaffirming what Aquinas would say, that it has the power in that part according to what it is. That's back to matter and form. But if you say again, oh no, it's in the part of the part. And if you can continually say that, then it's the part of 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 the part. But that creates an infinite regress. So at some point, you have to say that just at some level of material, according to the what it is, its form, it has certain powers in order for anything to have any causal powers at all. And we know that things do have causal powers. And therefore, we know that the causal power regress problem is not the way that the universe works. And therefore, we understand that things really have power according to being substances, i.e. having substantial forms impressed in matter. And now we're back to what Aquinas would say. Which brings us to the soul. So we have a form. And our form is it's the essence of what we are. It's our nature, and our nature is rational animal. So we have animality, we have bodies, but we also have rationality. We have minds. So we would say that it's this form, living form, so it's soul. In this soul, we have this rational mind. And one of the reasons we can know that we have that is because if I asked you to take a suitcase and put the suitcase in the suitcase, I would say that's impossible. Or if I gave you a cardboard box and I said, here's a cardboard box, it can contain things, can you cause it to contain itself? Say, no, of course I can't do that. That's impossible. That's not how material things work. Material things can't contain themselves. And yet, you, having a rational intellect, because you are a rational substance, can actually reflect upon your mind with your mind. So in a sense, you can contain yourself with yourself, showing that that's not a material process. Therefore, it's a immaterial or not material process. The next reason is, with forms, if we cause a material thing to take on a form, it becomes a thing. For instance, if I have a tree and I want it to take on the form of a podium, well, then the tree just becomes a podium. It's just made out of the wood of the tree, and now we have a podium. Or let's say I have a block of marble and I want it to take on the form of the David. Well, how does it do that? Well, it becomes the statue of David. That's how material takes on form. But wait, remember when the statue of David was actually chiseled? It was chiseled by Michelangelo, and he served as the efficient cause. And he had a mind. So when Michelangelo comes to chisel the first chisel blow, he holds in his mind the form of what will be. And in the mind, if that's holding the form, and we know it must, because otherwise he couldn't have been the efficient cause to bring about what he did, then that can't be a material place, the mind, because it would have become the statue of David, and it clearly didn't. We can all hold immaterial forms in our minds without our minds becoming that thing. Yet another reason why Aquinas would say that our soul is immaterial. And lastly, I'd say this one's probably the most clear, and that is our minds interact with immaterial things. If I asked one of you, can you bring me up a number 3? Not 3 of something, not number of 3 scratched on something to represent 3, a number 3. Well, you can't. If I said, hey, could you bring me a logical argument? Don't tell me just create vibrations in the sound waves of the, no. Bring me one, just plop it in my hand. Well, you can't, because all these things are immaterial. Numbers are immaterial. Logical propositions are immaterial. And yet, you and I, all of us, because we are a certain type of substance, we are matter, yes, but we have rational animality. That means that we have a rational intellect that can deal with these immaterial things in our universe, like numbers. Because you and I can actually manipulate them. I can take a 3, but I can hold it in my mind, and I can add it to another and create a 6. And finally, we would say that the soul, Aquinas would say this must be unified, and he follows Aristotle again here, when he says, because Michelangelo can conceive of the David as a whole, that means that one thing is conceiving of it. Let me give you an example of how this might not be. If you imagine like an insect's eyes, so it has compound eyes, and it sees the world, it sees this part here and this part here and that part. So if it's in parts and perceiving the world, then it only can see piece by piece. And yet we can understand forms in their entirety, showing that it's one thing doing the viewing, Another reason why the soul he would view as one thing. It's unified, it's simple, it's immaterial. All right, this is a big one and we have much to cover on this, but I think this one's very interesting. So about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, we have this, this great debate in Greece, and it's between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Now, Parmenides says there is no change. It's all an illusion, and here's why. Because imagine something changes from this to this. There's two possibilities. Either this goes out of existence before this comes into existence, at which point we have this dropping out of existence, and then this comes to be. But that's irrational because now we have something coming from non-being, and out of nothing, nothing comes. That's not possible. Or how about this scenario? We have this, and it's going to change into that, but instead of falling away before the next thing is created, it remains in existence, and then this comes to existence. But wait, this was created from nothing, because now we have two overlapping. This one just seems to stay static with no change, and poof, this came into existence. Out of nothing, and out of nothing, nothing comes. So this too is irrational. So we can't have something leaving existence before it changes into the next, nor can we have it staying in existence while the thing it changes into is in existence. So both of these are not possible. And these are the only two options because of the law of the excluded middle. Therefore, change is only an illusion. It seems like it changes, but this cannot be the place, actually the case, because we know this by reason. Well, Heraclitus comes along and says, no. Parmenides, you have it wrong. Let me explain. Sure, I guess if all that stuff were true, then whatever, no change. But your problem is that you think that there's anything static to begin with. And there's not, because everything is change. There is no stability. There's no this and then that. There's just endless chaos. His famous quote is, you can't step in the same river twice. He sees all of reality as just bubbling and changing and churning constantly like a river. So how exactly do we reconcile this? What do we do with these? Because both of them seem to have a claim on reality, and yet both of them seem to be flatly ridiculous. Of course things change. In fact, if we really want to make it pointed, we would say that, well, if nothing could change, then how could we move through an argument to decide that nothing could change? Because remember, I had to go from step 1 to step 2, did all the things with my hands, right? But if I can't change, then I can't make an argument. If I can't make an argument, then I can prove nothing, which is of course irrational. But if Heraclitus is right and everything is in flux, then I don't even have any continuity of self. So now I cannot prove anything, and nor can you, because you're not really a thing to begin with. You're a giant fluxing blob or something. But that's ridiculous. So we know there's change and we know there's stability. So something has to give. Enter Aristotle, Mr. Via Media, Mr. By the Middle. So what Aristotle says, and Thomas Aquinas follows and bakes deep into his philosophy and theology, is that no, you guys have missed something, and it's called potential. Potential is not non-being, but it's also not actuality. It's some middle stage in between the two. So something is actually this and potentially that. And then it's actualized into that, and the potential serves as a state of something that's neither it nor is it non-being, that allows for things to change. And this solves it. And pretty much everybody packs up their Heraclitus and, Heraclitus, Parmenides and Heraclitus t-shirts and just throws them away. He did it. So he settled this great question. And I would argue that this is a similar tension to what's going on with like Einstein, the theory of relativity, and quantum mechanics, where Einstein imagines a 4-dimensional block universe of the 3 dimensions plus time. Whereas quantum mechanics says, well, actually, the further into reality we look, we actually see more flux, more change. We see that things are less and less determined. We understand that something can be a wave and like a particle. We say that we can't know something's direction and its whatever else. And so we have this similar tension. And yet I would argue that even today, Aristotle's idea, this idea of act and potency, these two things being real features of the universe, that's how we can actually solve very practical problems. For instance, in quantum computing, it works because there are ones, existence, zeros, non-existence, and there's the superstate, which is neither a 1 nor a 0, and it's not a hidden 1, nor is it a hidden 0. it's a state of flux. It's potentially one and the other. And we actually solve cryptography using this. These are real machines which act using what Aristotle would say is the correct philosophical view of reality. So nuts and bolts, like rubber meets the road, that's the way it works. So a few things about potential. Potential is a very interesting, I wouldn't say power, because it doesn't have powers, a feature. It has a very interesting feature, and that is it seems to point to the future. For instance, here's some ice cubes. They're solid right now, but they're potentially liquid. That means that the substance, the what-isness joined with some type of material nature, that thing has in it a potential to be in a future state. So there's like a little arrow that says, I could be melted water. I could be steam. It's something which points outside of itself into a possible future state. So I'm going to leave that hanging now. That becomes important later. Next, I'm going to point out that potential can distinguish between two things. That's another interesting feature of it. For instance, imagine that we have two universes, both of them. All that's in the universe is just two little orbs, and they just rotate around each other forever and ever. That's all the universe is, just two things rotating around. But what if I told you that in one of the universes, if the balls ever actually touched, the whole universe would explode. But in the second universe, if they touched, they would just morph into one. And then I asked you, could you separate the one universe from the other kind of universe? Well, yes, you could. Because you could put one into the category of exploding universe and one non-exploding universe, but you can actually differentiate things according to potential, things which are not non-being, but aren't yet, are not actual yet. So what would pure potency be like? Well, Aquinas would say that that would be synonymous with prime matter. He sees matter as a principle of potency because all the things around us we understand are built out of matter. So we see that this took one form and I took another, and that based on what substantial form comes to inhabit is the type of thing that it is. So if we took every single substantial form away, since substantial form gives causal power, this thing would have zero power at all, and it would be kind of be like Heraclitus' amorphous mush. It would just have nothing except for, I guess maybe it could be sustained in existence, but it would have zero causal power. It would have nothing true that we could say about it because it had no substantial form. That's what pure potential would be like. So what would pure actuality be like? Well, Aquinas would say that if it had no potential, and it was just act, so it wasn't part non-being, and it wasn't part potential, and it was just pure actuality, well, then that thing, since act is from whence we get all power, it would have all the powers, and it wouldn't be lacking any, because if it lacked something, then that would be non-being in it, but it isn't, it's pure act, or it would potentially have that power, but it doesn't have potentials because we're talking about pure act. So he would say that it would be all powerful, for instance. And we'll get much more to what pure act might be like later. All right, so this is what Aquinas would say about God. He would say, first, he is totally other. So he uses the phrase totaliter aliter, completely other. So he doesn't think that he's another creature in creation. He doesn't think that like we're made out of God. He doesn't think any of those things. He believes that God is so entirely different from us that we can really not begin to comprehend it. Nevertheless, he views him as upholding all reality. So in a way that he's extraordinarily close to us, sustaining us in existence. He would also argue that he's absolutely simple. So Aquinas, and we'll see in the 5 ways how he goes on to prove this, he would say that he's completely unified. He doesn't have parts, he doesn't have pieces. He's not composed of matter and form. He's not partially contingent, partially necessary. None of those things. He's absolutely one and simple through and through. He'd also say he's the source of all things, source of all power, unbounded and limitless. And I'll offer an analogy that Aquinas would say that he's like the author of a book. So if you imagine that you were one of the characters in a book, and we're all talking amongst themselves, and they say, what do you think God is like? Well, maybe the characters suggest, hey, we're characters. Maybe he's just another character, maybe just a really powerful character. Well, that's flatly wrong because you haven't really explained anything. Because if you're all just characters, well, then you all need an explanation. Okay, what if they took one step further? Maybe some were very scientific, very philosophical, and they realized that all the characters were somehow generated out of the print on pages. And they saw this, these pages themselves as generating their entire reality. And they said, see, we have found God, that which generates all of us. It's clearly these pages, these ink, these words. Well, no, they're also wrong, maybe a little bit better than the first people who thought he was just another character in the book. But what they don't understand is that those words could have been anything. Those pages could have been used to form anything. That's not an explanation at all. That would kind of be analogous to people who believe that God is just like material, the people who believe in the God particle, things like that. No, that's just imagining that he's like the page of a book and you're the character. Well, maybe we can make one step possibly closer and say, well, actually, there's this story, right? So the story as a whole of all the characters, of all these things that caused the pages of the book to have these words and not that word. Maybe he's like the story in total. That would kind of be analogous to like panpsychists who believe that in pantheism, so that the universe is God, but specifically it's the soul of the universe is God. Well, Aquinas would say, no, that's not quite good enough either, because well, there's a number of issues with this, but one of which is it's the book in total that generates the characters, and this is just a part of it. And further, you would need some type of cause to explain why this story is joined with this book, because only in total do they generate these things. So he would reject both of these. So Aquinas would say he's most like the author of the book, because the author stands entirely outside of his work and yet generates it. And maybe this particular author is an overachiever and actually presses out the paper and creates his own ink and does it just from soup to nuts. So this is what he would view as analogous to God, entirely other, totally other, completely generating all things, not just the stuff that we're made out of, but everything entirely, including the entire story. Okay, we have reached the first of his 5 ways. And I will say this one in particular is Aquinas's favorite way. So we already covered some of act and potency. So I'm going to read through some of these. This isn't his exact words, but I tried to pull right from it for the sake of clarity and so that we can kind of see it in a more numbered format. First one, change exists, right? We agree, we're not Parmenides, change really exists. This one's just a pretty obvious reality. Next, things change when potential is actualized. Now, we kind of covered that a little bit earlier, but imagine that we have, the ice cubes, which are actually frozen, but they're potentially water. Well, it has this potential to be water. So we could actualize it by throwing it on a stove or hitting it with a blowtorch, right? And then it would become actually water. So that's the way that we understand change is expressed and understood. The actualization of potential. That's how we don't just fall into the trap of Heraclitus and Parmenides. Next, only something actual can actualize a potential. I know there's a lot of jargon going on here, but again, this one's quite simple. Let's say I have a stove, and the stove is only potentially hot. Well, a potentially hot stove can't burn my hand. It would have to be actually hot to burn my hand. So only things which are actual can go on to actualize potential. So I have a potential in my hand for it to be burned, and it can only be actualized by an actually hot stove. A potentially hot stove won't do because it's not actually hot. This is kind of a small point, though it might seem like a larger one. Next, nothing can be at the same time both in act and potential in the same way. What that means is that stove can't be actually hot and only potentially hot. Because if it was only potentially hot, it wouldn't be actually hot. So you can't be not actually hot and actually hot at the same time. So you can't be an act and potency at the same time in the same respect. So what does that mean? Well, therefore, nothing can actualize itself, because if I'm just in a state of potential and only something in act can actualize me, well, then I can't actualize myself. I'm only in a state of potential. So nothing can actualize itself because it would have to be already actual to do the actualizing. And if it was already actual, then why would it need to be actualized? So you can't actualize yourself. Therefore, everything is actualized or changed by something else. Okay, so far so obvious. But the sequence of act and potency can't continue forever. Therefore, it's necessary to arrive at a first actualizer that in no respect is in need of being actualized. And of course, this everybody calls God. He's lending the actuality to all things. I know I went through that quickly, so let's hit a few examples. First, just the picture of the train. Now, each one of the train cars is potentially in motion or potentially changing from one place to another. But it's being pulled along. So if you imagine a given train car, it's being pulled by the one in front of it, which is being pulled by the one in front of it, which is being pulled by the one in front of it. So each one is successively being actualized. The actuality is being passed through this chain. But if we had only these types of beings, ones which were only actualized by another, well, then it'd be like a bunch of train cars, and they would be still, they would be motionless, because again, you can't actualize yourself. And we just, if we have an infinite amount of train cars, they don't just all of a sudden become moving, because each one gets its motion from something prior. So there has to be a first in the sequence. So what we would need is a locomotive. It's something totalitarian, something entirely other. It's something different from those train cars. It's something that's not in need of being actualized. Why? Well, it's because it's pure act. It's in no sense potential, and it's not non-being. It's something that just has motion. It has actuality according to its own nature. And this is necessary in order for there to be any motion or change. And there is change. Therefore, this thing does exist. Let me give you another example. Imagine we have a circuit, an electrical circuit. So every individual node or every single wire receives its power from the thing prior. But if we just have an infinitely long wire, will it have power? No. Why? Because wires are the type of things which transfer power. They're not the type of things which have power in and of themselves. You might have to have a power plant or a battery or something entirely different from this sequence of things in order to provide the power to even the last thing. I'm going to make a quick distinction here between two different types of series. Aquinas believes that it's possible to go infinitely with one type of series, the accidentally ordered series. For instance, I assume you had a mother. Did your mother have a mother? Okay, Aquinas would say that potentially it is possible, it is not irrational to believe that that type of series could go on forever, because you don't need your great-great-great-great-great-grandmother to be in existence in order for you to then have a daughter to be the mother to the next person. We have the power being transferred to each individual one of the set. So Aquinas thinks that, sure, maybe we can't prove from reason that there's a beginning of the universe. It's possible that there's this type of chain. He would say that it's possible that we have this accidentally ordered series. So everything can actually give that real power to the next. But what he doesn't think is possible is to have an essentially ordered series. And that's what we talked about with the train. It's not that we just have one hitting the next and then it has the real power inside of itself to do the next thing, and then it gives the real power inside of itself to do the next thing. No, at any given moment as the train is running, it is always being actualized by the first member. In the same way that at any given point in that circuit, it is always only because of the power of the original member. So he thinks that this one cannot go to infinity because at this moment, it relies on the first member. It's not something that's subject to what we explained earlier in that causal sequence. Let me just give one more example here. And the last one, admittedly, is less technically precise. So if any Thomists were listening, they'll probably be mad, but I don't care. So I call it the unhigh-fived high-fiver. Now, if I said, and we're going to set this up in a similar act potency way, that I want you guys to give each other a high five, but only if you've already been high-fived by another. Okay? So give somebody a high five, but only if you've already been high-fived by another. Go. As you can hear, there's no high fives. Why? I have an idea. Maybe not enough people came to my talk. Maybe I'm not popular enough. Maybe I'm not interesting enough. Maybe if we brought all of Waynesboro here, we had a whole bunch of people and we said, all right, same rules apply. You can only high five if you've been high-fived by another. Go. Nothing will happen. Okay. What if we had an infinite amount of people? Obviously, that doesn't solve the problem. What would we need? We would need somebody to be able to pass that one high five up through the chain. We would need an unhigh-fived high-fiver. Somebody can actually begin the chain. See, he's feeling divine right now. Yeah. There you go. If you were an unhigh-fived high-fiver, you could begin this chain. Okay, so now we're going to hit some objections. Aquinas is famous for his objections, and commonly his objections are way more powerful than the things which his opponents can come up with. He really critically analyzes his own opinions, and he comes up with very difficult objections. And you often read and go, oh my goodness, Aquinas, how are you going to wiggle out of this one? And he does. All right, so we're going to hit a few. First one, you're going to hear this one all the time. Of course an infinite series is possible. Everything needed motion, and everything got motion from the thing prior. So what's the problem? But I think we already split that into two different sections. We talked about the essentially and the accidentally ordered series. That, sure, Aquinas would say that's possible too, but only if the real power of doing that thing is actually seated in the next member such that it's not dependent on the prior thing. But in these cases that we're offering, they are dependent on the prior thing. Therefore, we can't have an infinite series. The next is, well, this act potency distinction is just false. But I think we also covered that one. We preempted that one in the slide about act and potency, where that seems to be necessary in order for there to be both stability for things to exist, which they do, and for there to be change, and we understand change is existent. So we can't throw that one away. And finally, we see that that seems to even solve practical issues in science. Next, well, the first mover is just a basic particle or like a physical thing. But again, we already examined what would it like to be pure act. And that's like the opposite of being pure potential. And what they're saying is that it's a basic particle. What we discussed earlier, Aquinas would say that's like prime matter. That's like the least in act thing. That's something in most need of being actualized. That's in the most potential situation. So in a way, proposing the answer of, well, maybe it's just a material basic particle, that's like the most wrong answer you can get because it has the least actuality. And yet we're looking for the basic actuality, which powers all the actuality in the universe. So that's the worst answer we can give. Which leads us to the next objection. Well, this first mover doesn't have all actuality, just enough to kind of kick the ball down, get the dominoes going. Well, the problem with that is, again, actuality doesn't come from nothing, as we talked briefly about earlier. It's the actualization of a potential, and that's the type of series which depends on the first member. So in order for things to have any act or any power, they're all coming from this first member. So this first member contains within itself the principle of all actuality. So it can't just be a piece of it. If it was a piece of it, we'd have no explanation for the actuality that goes over and above it later, which is, of course, ridiculous because that would have to be actualized itself and drawn into the sequence. So, last objection. Why can't there be many of these gods? Well, for this, Aquinas would say, well, if we define God as this ultimate member powering all actuality, etc., he's the fullness of all actuality, well, then we can compare some candidates. Let's say we have God number one here. And we have God number one here. I hate to put myself in the place of God, but now if we're to distinguish between these two candidates, the only way we could distinguish it if one had something that the other did not. But wait, if one lacks something that the other has, then one of them stands in potential to gain something, right? So he has a potentiality, which means he's not pure act, which means this candidate is off the stage. So if we were to try to choose between the two, and if one lacked anything, then we would say it would have to be the other. That's why there must be the one. And we'll get on into why there can't be a combination of act and potency in his next way, where we talk about composite beings. The second way, efficient causality. All right, so I think we remember what an efficient cause is. It's something which fuses together material and form. And in a broader sense, it's something that fuses things together in total. For instance, even if we had a form and we just had raw existence between the two, like the number one, it's real, it has a form, but doesn't have material. He would say that it would need existence and it would need form. So it's something that brings these two into composition, like that construction company that built our bridge earlier. So we perceive a series of efficient causes of things in the world, right? Things are generated out of other things. Nothing exists prior to itself. Right? You can't be your own efficient cause. You can't have a construction company build the construction company. You can't have this nice man chisel himself out of stone because he would first have to exist to begin chiseling. And if he existed before he needed to chisel, then he wouldn't need to chisel to begin with, right? You can't be before yourself to create yourself, because if you were before yourself, you wouldn't need to create yourself. So you can't exist prior to yourself. That's irrational. So therefore, we understand nothing is the efficient cause of itself, because it can't pre-exist itself to create that composition. Well, if a previous efficient cause does not exist, neither does the thing that results, right? So we understand that if there's something that was brought into composition, it's composed in some way, that it depends on having been brought into composition. It depends on something which brings it into unity. Because if that didn't exist, it would not be in unity. And if it was not in unity, it would not exist. So everything depends on that cause that brings it into unity. Okay? Therefore, if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in the series exists. So again, we have one of these essentially ordered causal series, but in this case, we're not talking about act potency, we're talking about this certain type of cause. So if this series of events extends infinitely into past, there would be no things now. Why? Because everything would be awaiting the fulfillment of a condition. And that condition would be that something gets brought into composition, so that something gets brought into composition, so that I am brought into composition. But we don't have this infinite chain because we do see that things have indeed been brought into composition, namely you and I. So there are things that exist now, therefore we can't have an infinite series because it's not the type of series that we can have go into infinity. Therefore, efficient causes do not extend ad infinitum into the past. Therefore, it's necessary to admit a first cause that by reason of its simple nature does not require an efficient cause to form it as a composite. This uncaused cause of all composite natures and generator of the efficient causal series is what we call God. Because remember, for Aquinas, God is simple, he's one. So he's not composed of parts, he's not matter and form, he's not this and that, he's one. So if something is completely unified, does it need an efficient cause? No. Why? Because efficient causes bring things into composition, but he's not composed of parts. Therefore, this is the type of being that can begin our series, not just as an arbitrary, just we're not counting him, you know, what else are we going to do? No, by reason of his nature of being unified and simple, this is the type of being that can initiate this type of chain, and the only type of being. Okay. So no composite being explains itself. Everything points outside of itself. That chain can't go on forever, so it has to terminate in something that does explain itself. So matter without form can't do anything, because remember we talked about earlier that substances have their power because they're informed, right? They have some type of form. You have your rational animality powers because you have a rational animal form. If your form was removed, like a tragic accident, you I don't know, fall into a wood chipper. Now your form is removed, but the matter remains, and now you don't have any of your powers of intellect, any of your animal powers either, because the form has been removed from the matter. So we would say that matter by itself, without a form, well, it can't really do anything. There's just prime matter can't be doing these things. It's the principle of potentiality, after all. So matter can't explain this sequence. Well, what about form? Well, form explains why it's this and not that. But when we look at forms like numbers and essences and things like that, they're causally inert. Nobody says, oh man, I tripped because of the number 1. Or, oh, you know, there was the essence of butterfly, and that really distracted me. Well, no, these things are causally inert. They would have to be actually informed into matter, right? So that's not the type of form that could do the beginning. But there's one more that's kind of like a form that we talked about earlier, this soul, this mind. So a mind can indeed bring things into composition. A mind is immaterial, so we don't have the problems with the matter. So it's immaterial, and it does have causal power. So that begins to get into focus what God might be. He's absolutely simple, but we remember something else that was simple, our soul. That was the seat of our mind. So now we start to get clued in a little bit about what begins this whole thing. It seems to be a divine, completely simple mind, because that's the only thing that would meet our descriptions of what would be necessary to have this chain begin. Okay. Now, I know I'm harping on this one, but this is the objection you always see. Well, sure, this infinite series could happen. Why not? Well, again, Aquinas explains, and I think this picture demonstrates you can't chisel yourself out of stone because you'd first have to exist to do the chiseling. So again, this is one of the series that must have a first member because it depends on the first member. Nothing would be in composition if all things did not hold those things in composition to begin with. Some people propose, well, maybe there's like a circular causality where this causes that and that causes this and this causes that. So we don't need it to be in a line. We could have it in a circle. There are serious people who suggest this, to which I say, open up Excel, or if you are more enlightened, LibreOffice, and type in this square equals this, and this one equals that, and that one equals this, and this one equals that. Make yourself that circular thing and see what it says. It, using the laws of logic, will say error. What are you doing? You can't define something in a circle because nothing is ever defined. So you can't just create a web of causality and expect things to spring into existence. It does indeed rely on a first member. Okay, and finally, this cause doesn't have to be God. Well, for this, we talked a little bit about how it's likely a mind, how it's divinely simple, and all that good stuff. And we have many more ways to cover. So fantastic. All right, we've reached the third way. This one actually is modeled after Avicenna's proof for the existence of God, who's a philosopher of the Islamic tradition. And there's two ways to read this one. There's a little bit of disagreement, so I'm going to present both to you. So it begins with possible beings are the type of beings that are generated and then corrupted, or are destroyed, go out of existence. Now imagine for a moment that every being is a possible being like this. So every being in the universe, let's imagine, was the type of being that's both generated and then corrupted or can be destroyed. For each possible being, there's a time it does not exist because it does not contain within its nature incorruptibility and is therefore at some point corrupted, or else it was formerly not generated. Therefore, it is impossible for these always to exist. Therefore, there could have been a time when no things existed because they were either not generated yet, or else they were already corrupted. Therefore, at that time, there would be nothing to bring about currently existing contingent or possible beings into existence. Therefore, nothing would be in existence now. Therefore, not everything can be a possible being. Necessary beings are either necessary through themselves or through another. Now, there can't be an infinite series of necessary beings that are always deriving their necessity through another. Therefore, some being exists of its own necessity. It does not receive its necessity from another, but rather causes them, and this all men speak of as God. So I kind of embedded two ways to understand that. And the first one is, imagine that there's an infinitely wide highway, infinitely many lanes, and there's cars streaming down it. We line up all of the possible beings at the side of the road, and the possible being's job is to cross the infinite lanes of traffic without getting hit. Well, these beings are not the type of beings that are incorruptible. They can be destroyed. They can be corrupted. So we would expect that if they moved through an infinite past, and they had to go through an infinite amount of points where they could be taken out of being, that at some point, with all the possible beings crossing potential events that could take them out of existence, at some point, just another one bites the dust, and eventually we have none. And if there ever got to a point where all in the universe there was possible beings, and they all went out of existence, then there would be nothing. And out of nothing, nothing comes. And if we did indeed have an infinite past, as was argued and at times is still argued, then there would be nothing now, because we live now, and well, out of nothing, nothing comes. Therefore, not every being can be only a possible being. That's one reading. The other reading is, well, the type of beings are ones which are generated and corrupted. But let's focus on generated. So every single one had to have conditions fulfilled in order for it to be generated. Okay, but we can't have an infinite amount of things which are always awaiting a condition to be fulfilled in order to be generated. because these aren't things that exist through their nature, they exist through another. And that type of chain can't go on infinitely if everything had to await some type of fulfillment of conditions in order for it to be generated, and yet nothing existed prior to generate it, there'd be nothing now, there'd be no possible beings. So in either case, if we accept that they're generated or if we accept that they're corruptible, in either case, it would seem that we can't have that time pass and still have things here, but we do have things here. Therefore, we can't have a universe of only possible contingent beings. So therefore, we have, well, I'll give one more example here, the backwards IOU. So imagine I say, hey, I owe you an IOU of an IOU of an IOU, and I just extended that infinitely, an IOU which owed the previous IOU, which owed the previous IOU. If I don't finally ground it in IOU I don't know, a $20 bill, then none of the IOUs have value, even in the present. It has to be grounded in I owe you what? So this is constantly asking, I'll exist if the conditions are fulfilled of your existence, of your existence, which is only existing because of your existence. It ultimately has to be grounded in something for the entire chain of IOUs, if you will, to have any value. And we see that they do have value because we all exist. So that is how he concludes on there can't be a universe of just possible beings. But that's just his, like, he kind of takes that for granted in a way. A lot of people think that most of it is just arguing about the idea that there can't be possible beings. That's not what he's trying to get to. He's trying to get to the part about necessary beings, that very quick process of you can't have things which are always necessary through another. Therefore, something must be necessary through itself. That's the core of the argument. So there's a few objections. One is, well, matter is the necessary being. But again, we don't really care. This one just completely misses the point. He would say, yeah, cool story, man, whatever. You want to pick matter as your necessary being? Whatever. My whole point is that we must have at least one necessary being. If you want to call it matter, dandy. Well, maybe things pop into being without a cause. That's what some people kind of bring about. Well, maybe things just like pop in out of nothing. I think we covered that elsewhere. But that would mean that if there was truly nothing prior to it coming into existence, then we'd have to ask what conditions need to be fulfilled for something to pop into existence. Well, if it can pop out of nothing, then the answer is, well, actually, no conditions need to be fulfilled in order for it to pop into existence. But the problem with that is, if all the conditions that need to be fulfilled are just an empty set, then we should see things popping into existence all the time because all the conditions are fulfilled at any time, at any place for something to pop into existence, namely no conditions. But we don't see things popping into existence for no reason and out of nothing. And that makes sense and accords with reason, of course, that that's not possible. And of course, we could lean back on our act potency distinction. And finally, people say, well, it's just a fallacy of composition. Just because individual things in the universe are contingent doesn't mean the whole universe is contingent. Again, kind of misses the point. We're trying to argue for a necessary being. Even if somebody said, well, it's the universe, Aquinas would shrug and say, cool, whatever. I'm trying to get to the point where we say it's either necessary through itself or necessary through another. So we have to explain how it would be necessary through itself. And Aquinas would argue that it would have to be simple because it can't be composite. It'd have to be purely act, as he leans in his first way. And it can't be necessary on other things to bring about its own generation, nor could it be generated because there'd be a time when it was not. Nor could it be the type of being that can go out of existence because, again, over an infinite past, it would have already gone out of existence. So this thing that he concludes to, he would call God. This one is my favorite. And that's strange because it's every other Thomistic person's least favorite. Most of the time when philosophers go over these 5 ways, this is the one they go, and then there's a 4th way. And anyways, let's get on to the other ones and just hit the summa after this. We don't care about this way, but it is my favorite because I think with a little bit of explanation, it really appeals to common sense. And as you can see, there's a lot less up there. The words are actually readable and large. There's a gradation to be found in things. Some things have more or less goodness, more or less existence, more or less truth. Predications of degree require reference to the utmost case that defines the set. And don't worry, I'll explain all this. The maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus. That's straight from Aristotle. And again, we'll explain that part. Therefore, there must be something which is to all beings the cause of their goodness, being, and every other perfection, and this we call God. And this is why people skip it, because you all have blank looks on your face, like how on earth does that prove God? All right, well, let's just give a few examples and we'll jump right in. I think that's the best way to clarify this. Again, it is my favorite argument. So let's take a few examples and just bear with me on this one. If I say, if salt makes things salty, what makes salt salty? We would say, well, salt just contains within its nature the reason for its own saltiness. Why? Because to be salty is to be like salt, and nothing can be more like salt than salt itself. Or if I said, hey, I found in the universe things that are more and less salty or like salt, what would that mean? It would mean salt exists. Why? Because if it didn't, there'd be no ontological referent. We're not referring to anything real. But if things are indeed salty, more or less, that means there's such thing as salt. Also, if we said that there are things which are more and less red, well, that means that redness exists because some things are more or less red. Or finally, we could say the number one, if things are more or less unified, well, then that means that there must be one. Okay? Now, does this mean that there's some type of form of salt existing in a Platonic heaven, which is beaming down powers of saltiness to your pretzel and your olive and things like that? No, that's not what he's saying. Does this mean that there's like some most salty block of salt, which is right now just like orbiting the earth, somehow giving power out so that we have saltiness in all of our salty things? No, it's a much more common sense thing than that. If things can be more or less salty, it just means that salt exists, not in a Platonic heaven and not just in one material instantiation, but it means that the nature of the form of salt indeed exists. And it's the cause of its own saltiness. Why? Because it's appeal to its own nature. Nothing can be more salty than salt itself, because salty means to share in the nature of salt. So now the next question is, do we see degrees of being or degrees of existence? And again, Aquinas would argue, yes. For instance, there's you and then there's your shadow. Now, which one has more existence? I would argue clearly you, because you cause your shadow to exist. But if your shadow disappears, I can assure you, you will be just fine. So you have a relationship with your shadow where it depends on your existence, but it still does exist. After all, we can make true predications about your shadow. Your shadow is there and not there. Likewise, we could say a thought in your mind. So we think that your mind is more real than the thought because the thought is dependent on your mind. True enough, your thought can go in and out of existence and your mind, again, will be just fine, but not the other way around. And finally, if you're still not accepting the point that things have more or less existence, I would offer you, the listener, versus the totality of all reality, which one has more existence? I really hope you didn't answer yourself, right? So we would say the set of all things other than yourself would have more existence than just you, or just a rock, or just a speck of dust. So we see degrees of existence in things. Okay, do we see degrees of truth? Yes, we do. How so? 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4.1. 2 + 2 = potato. Can everybody in this room rank those from most to least true? Of course you can. That's not hard. We all have normal rational intellects. We can see that there are some things with more truth, some things with less truth. Furthermore, I would argue that that being and truth have a relationship. For instance, that potato that I talked about earlier can ground less truths than, say, your best friend. You can see more true things. More truth can be derivative of your best friend than can be true of a potato. Unless, of course, potato is your best friend, but that aside. And finally, perfections. So perfections meaning completeness. So this completeness, again, we see things are more and less perfect or more and less complete. And that, again, is derivative of being. So this set we call the transcendentals, things which are philosophically convertible into being. We have perfection, we have goodness, we have truth, we have things like that belong to this set. And of course, Thomas and other philosophers disagree what belongs to it. But that beside the point, we'll stick with this. So we understand that existence and all these other things seem to have degrees. So what does that mean? Well, remember our previous examples about salt, right? Salt contains in itself the reason for its own saltiness, right? And we know that the maximum of the genus is the cause of all in that genus, right? Salt is the cause of all saltiness. So if salt itself disappeared, well, then you can't have something salty. You would have something y. Or you can't have something like salt if salt didn't exist, because you would just have something like blank, no ontological referent. So what about existence? We could say that your shadow has existence-ness, or is existee, right? It shares in the nature of existence. Okay. Well, again, Aquinas' definition of God is the pure act of to be. He's the pure act of existence. He is existence as a verb. But what do we see here? We see existence in these degrees. We see being in degrees, and in all of these other cases, we understand that the maximum of the genus is the cause of all in that genus. So we would say that God, in a sense, is the maximum of the genus of being. So if things can be more or like existence itself, that means existence must exist. And that is what we're talking about as God. And again, if things can be more or less true, then we have to have truth itself, which grounds all true things. And same is with goodness, perfection, and things like that. Which, once we have this kind of in our minds, we can deal with the perennial objection. Well, if God made everything exist, what caused God to exist? Well, once you understand what we mean by God, the pure act of existence, you're saying, well, if the pure act of existence made all things exist, what made the pure act of existence exist? But wait a minute, the pure act of existence contains within its nature the reason for its own existence, right? Because we could substitute in our other examples, right? So if salt makes things salty, what makes salt salty? Well, salt contains within its nature the reason for its own saltiness. Red contains within its nature the reason for its own redness. Now, the difference between existence and these other things like saltiness and redness are that there's no reason salt must exist. There's the nature of salt plus existence, and that's how we get salt. We have red, the nature, plus existence. That's how we get red, and then it can be found in different material forms. But existence is completely different from these things, because you don't need existence plus anything else to exist, because we're already talking about existence. So again, we come back to what we've talked about earlier. Existence itself explains its own existence because it is the maximum of that genus. So a word about this, and this one's a bit pedantic. Aquinas later says that it's not entirely true to say that God is in a genus, because he doesn't think that we can just categorize God as if God is like this, he's in that category. Because there can't be any limitations on God, because a limitation would need existence first, but it would only get that derivative of God, so he can't be limited. And if it had any power to limit, well, it would need that power from the one pure act, which is God, so there's no power that could limit him. So he would say that we can't even really put him in the genus of being. So an analogy would be, he's like a limit simplister. For example, if I take a set of polygons and I have a triangle, I add a side and there's a square. I add a couple more sides, I have an octagon. I add a bunch more sides after that. And then I have something which has 1,000 sides. What does it start to look like? Well, it starts to look like a circle, right? So we would say that's the limit simpliciter of the set. It's moving towards being a circle as we add more sides. But at the same time, we would say that a circle wouldn't belong at the end of that set, but kind of at the beginning, because how many sides does a circle have? It only has one. And we see that as we move the other way in the direction, a triangle only has 3 sides. So it belongs at the beginning and the end of the set. It is what all things start to move towards, but at the same time, it's at the very beginning. So Aquinas would use that kind of as a way to view God, so that yes, we have all these good things, we have all these true good things, we have all these perfect things and whatnot. And it's true that as we kind of go up this ladder, we see things that become more and more perfect. You have more perfections, you have more goodness than some base atom or something like that. But where does God actually belong? The most complex being? Aquinas would say no, he's divinely simple. So in this way, he's the alpha and the omega. He belongs at both ends of the set. He's the maximum of this genus, but in a way that we can't really say that he's confined by it. And that's how he produces all these effects. All right, let's hit a few objections. So if you guys have read Dawkins, and if you have, just, I don't know, throw it away or something, he offers the counterexample. He says, well, if stink exists, there must be a maximally stinky being, right? And he says in much more colorful and interesting language in this. But I ask, well, what does this prove? Well, if stink exists, if things are more and less stinky, well, Dawkins would be right that that proves that stink exists. If things can be more or less like stink, then stink exists. But again, as we talked about earlier, all these other things which aren't rooted in being have no reason for them to exist or not exist. They would have to be their nature plus being. So what we're talking about is in another category, because the category of existence doesn't need anything added to it to exist, because it contains within its nature the reason for its own existence. Some people say, well, this is circular reasoning. You're defining these terms in such a way that it has to be. Well, it's true that we come to a conclusion of the argument where it must be. But again, there's nothing circular about this. We began with the gradation of being. We moved on to show that the maximum of a genus is the cause of all in that genus. And we ended with God as the maximum of the genus, which causes all these things after understanding that there are gradations of them. And finally, there is, well, if God is all perfect and all good, right? So we have all goodness, all perfection. He doesn't need anything. Then why did he create anything? And we'll cover this one a little bit later. But for now, we'll just say that he didn't need to create anything. He didn't gain anything from creating. So there's God existing by himself, totally unified, totally simple, the absolute act, completely perfect, utterly necessary being. Containing all goodness and perfections. He had no reason to create. The only reason that he did was not for his benefit, but for ours. So we say that he actually generated all things out of a completely self-giving act of love. And that's why all things exist. It's because he loved us before we actually existed. And that's the only explanation, because he could benefit not at all. Because he doesn't even have the potential to benefit, because he is utterly without potential. And the final way. So Aquinas' fifth way, this one is admittedly tricky. And this one comes from final causality. And if you've kind of been tracking, you see that some relate more to material, some more to efficient cause, more to formal, some to formal. And this one is final. And recall that the final is, why did the form take this form and not another, right? It's the why of the form. So we see that natural bodies work towards some goal, and they don't do so by chance, because they arrive at them again and again. For instance, an electron is always attracted to a positive charge, not just, oh, no, they just kind of happen to be by chance. No, it's according to the form of what it is, right? So there's some type of finality. It reaches its end, and that explains the form. It's an electron. So most natural things lack knowledge. So it's not that it's thinking, you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reach my final end today. I mean, after all, I have the form of an electron. So you know what? I'm going to do it. No, it doesn't. So it doesn't have a mind to decide that it's going to do this. And recall in our section of act and potency, we said that potential has this very curious feature. It's like an arrow that points out of itself. It's saying, hey, there's a future state that I could do. But again, only minds can imagine the future. And these things clearly don't have minds. It's an electron. We move on. As an arrow reaches its targets, because it's directed by an archer. What lacks intelligence achieves its goals by being directed by some other intelligence. So if we see it's not by chance, but it is directed, it's aimed at a final end, and it can't do this by itself, then we would say that there's something else that directs it towards it. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Now, what this argument is not, and is actually not, is anything like William Paley's watchmaker analogy, where if you find a watch, oh, it's complicated, therefore there must be a designer. No, if that's what you're thinking, you misunderstood it. This is talking about a feature of his metaphysical convictions, which is potency, and how that gets actualized such that something according to its form moves towards its final end. All right, now an analogy, because this one's a little tricky without an analogy. I hope you like this picture. Okay, so recall that things can be distinguished based on their potential. Recall that potentials point to a final state. So imagine a scenario. We're over at the CERN laboratories. We have our greatest scientists, and they're twiddling their thumbs. They're doing whatever they do with government dollars. And all of a sudden, a wormhole opens up. And this just like basic mattery gook comes into being. And then it just in a ball starts to self-assemble, right? Gravity causes things to come into this shape, and then electromagnetism causes it to become that shape. And luckily, they had all of their scientific stuff trained on it, so they're tracking this whole entire process. And then after this giant causal cascade, at the very end of it, we have this friendly fellow. And he can walk, and he can talk, and he can do all sorts of other things. He can explore our world. He can understand true features of where he's at. He can do all that kind of stuff. Now, one of the scientists says, hey, do you think, when the wormhole opened, this guy was kind of like sent here? Like, they get blasted in, and then, well, clearly it had to have the potential to take this form and not another. And it couldn't have just, gucky matter can't just decide to just become this, right? So it had to be directed towards an end. So maybe there's like an intelligence on the other side of this wormhole that sent it here. Well, that actually kind of seems pretty reasonable. And Aquinas would agree, but what if one of the scientists said, no. You see, we had our camera trained on it. We had our instruments trained on it. We understand the final form. And look, we can go back, and there's a reason for every single successive step, all the way back to this like basic explosion out of this wormhole, all right? So there's nothing to see here. No reason to think there's intelligence. No reason to think that there's anything on the other side of this amazing occurrence. I'm just really not interested in this phenomenon because it didn't break the laws of physics after all. So what is this? Random chance? Maybe just laws of the universe? Sure, but it can't be an intelligence because we saw this causal sequence. Well, you and the other scientists would likely say, okay, your argument has literally nothing to do with what we saw here. We're not saying that it has to break a causal sequence. We're not saying it has to break a law of physics. No, we're saying that from the very beginning, it had a potential and it pointed to a final state, and it couldn't have done it by itself. Therefore, there had to be an intelligence which endowed it with this potential to be this and not that, so that it could actually move around and do all these amazing things that it did. So there must be an intelligence on the other side of it. So I would argue that you are the Cyberman. I am the Cyberman. Because we too, at the Big Bang, there was just material that came into existence. But from the very beginning, there was a potential that pointed towards a future state. And we are one of those future states. And we have real causal powers to go about and explore the world and even do unbelievable things like reflect back on how we were generated. We can conceive with our immaterial minds of our immaterial minds. We have all of these powers that, as ridiculous as it would be to say for the scientists, well, maybe there's just no explanation, that couldn't be an intelligent thing. We have much bigger of a problem because there's not one Cyberman in a lab. We have billions of people and galaxies and all of these amazing things which unfolded from a real potential as we understood from the act potency section, and therefore they had to be endowed with this potential and actualized towards the goal. And this thing which caused all these things to come about, everyone would call God. As for objections, well, it's not chance that makes these things arrive to their end. It's a buzzword among some circles. It's emergent order, right? The order just emerged, okay? Well, first, that's not an explanation. And second, if we want to call it emergent order, well, dandy, what we're just saying is that order emerged. The question is not if it did or why it did. The question is, does it follow from what Aquinas would say about final causality? And if so, that relates back to a mind, because a mind's the only thing that can conceive of the future and move something to an end. So that doesn't really touch the argument. The next one is, well, it's the laws of physics that cause things to act in predictable ways. Aquinas would shrug and say, okay, cool story, bro. Anyways, not relating to the argument. And on another point, Aquinas would argue from his metaphysics that laws of physics are not prescriptive, like, hey, man, slow down, speed of light and stuff. You got to chill it. Or, hey, I need you to drop, in a vacuum at 32 feet per second. No. They don't prescribe to matter to do things. Instead, they're descriptive. They describe how things with real natures, how those substances with real causal powers actually act in the real world. So he would reject that one from the beginning, saying that there's laws of physics which exist in some Platonic heaven and zap down commands to matter. He would say, no, the form subsists in the thing, and this subsisting substantial form is what causes powers to act, and they act reliably because the form is the same, even though the matter could be differentiating the two. Finally, some say, well, this teleology idea is just dumb projection. It's kind of like when a toddler stubs his toe and goes, oh, it was the wall. The wall didn't have any intention. So this is just an outgrowth of just a childish idea of imagining that everything has some type of purpose. Well, first, that's more of an ad hominem than an actual argument. And again, I don't think it really addresses any feature of what he's saying. And finally, we do understand that teleology and things are directed towards an end for many reasons, but one of which is we direct them to ends. If you look around, everything that we see was directed towards an end, so we understand that's a real feature of the universe. And we did it. We covered all 5 ways. So let's just do a quick summary. Thomas Aquinas says that God is the totalitarian. He's entirely, completely other. So for this reason, he uses what's called apophaticism, meaning we try to chisel away what God isn't to kind of isolate and kind of get a view of what God might be. So we know from this point going through the 5 ways that he's not potential or changeable because he has no potencies, he's pure act. We know he's not caused or generated from the second and the third way. We know he's not a matter and form composite because then he would need some explanation for his being a composite being. And we understand that can't be from the second way. He's not contingent on anything, not even another necessary being, because then that thing would be God. We know this from the third way. He can't be less than perfect. He can't be less than all good or all true because he grounds all perfection as the cause of all good and all truth and all existence. So he can't be anything less than that. So he's all those things. He can't be less than absolute existence because if there's anything outside, then it wouldn't be caused by him. And we can see the first way, heck, the second way, the third, all the ways say that he must be the absolute unbounded existence. And finally, we understand that there are real powers of act. For instance, we have mind, we have intellect, we have will, and this is a type of act that we have, but a tiny sliver. But if he is the source of all act, like a battery is the source of all electricity in that circuit, then he must have at least mind. He must have at least will in order for the actualities of mind and will to exist. So if we see any power, he has to have at least that power because he is the power behind all things having power. So we understand that he can't be without a mind and he can't be without a will. Which brings us to, well, from this, what can we conclude about God? Well, therefore, we know that he must be all powerful. One power is the power of knowing, so he must be all knowing. And again, he must be all good. He must be all present. And what do we mean by that? What means not that there's like one God there and one God over here, but instead in the same way that in our example of the author in the book, where is the author vis-a-vis the characters? Well, he's actively upholding the characters, right? And if it first existed in the author's mind, then, well, he's all around, he's through those characters. He's upholding them in every possible way. So God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. So in that way, God is all present. But in another way, he's totalitarian. He's entirely other from us, like the characters in the author. And yet he's in and through in a way which is in power. Well, he's totally other than creation, right? Because he can't be part of creation because creation is itself a composite being, and that would answer to something prior, and he is that thing prior. So he's totally other than creation. He's totalitarian. He's the cause of all things. He has a mind, and part of having a mind is having a will, because a mind can look at things and a will can understand them as good and then address that good to themselves or another. And finally, we understand from earlier that he must be love. He must have love. And since he's simple, if he has something, he is that thing. It's all unified into one being, which is God. And that's the only explanation for anything existing because it couldn't have benefited him. And clearly it benefited us because we all exist. So he loved the world into existence. That's the only explanation for it. And that means what is in him is one Thomistic principle because he's unified. So that means he is love. All right. So Aquinas sees a unity between faith and reason. So he thinks that faith and reason are both directed towards one thing, which is truth. And recall from the fourth way that truth is all unified, grounded, and made true ultimately by God who is truth. So he sees no contradiction. He doesn't think, oh, well, there's people with faith here and people with reason there. And, it's all, no. They all, when operating correctly, point at one thing, which is God. So to give an example, we would say, imagine that there's two groups of gardeners, and they're both responsible to make a beautiful garden. And one receives plants and is just given them whole and entire and can transplant them into his garden. The other is just given little seeds and puts them in, carefully tends them and waters them and prunes them and fertilizes them and grows them into the plants. Well, they've both arrived at the same end, this beautiful garden, which we'll say is analogous to truth. But they've done it in very different ways. So Aquinas would say that faith is an ability given to us by God, whereby we can view things as true directly, not through a sequence of steps, but just understand truth as truth. So he would say that there's some things which are kind of on the top of the pile, like understanding the Trinity, which we'll talk about briefly. And then there's other things which are on the other side. And I'll offer one explanation. Let's say the principle of non-contradiction. Or if I just said the principle of identity, A equals A. You don't have to move through a succession of steps in order to conclude this by reason. It's actually assumed by reason from the very beginning. You can't even make an argument for the principle of identity without first using the principle of identity. Otherwise, even your words have no meaning. So there are certain things that we accept because we view true things as true for like those examples. And then Aquinas would say on the other end, we have theological things where God allows us to view large true things as true. So those small things are analogous to those seeds that the one gardener got. He accepted the seeds of the principle of sufficient reason, of identity and non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, and he plants them carefully in the soil that's around us in the created world. And then he's able to grow these things into great truths. And he sees this is what the philosophers did. He would see this is what Aristotle, Plato, and others would do. And then, alternatively, there are some people who are given the true thing just there. It's yours, and this is by faith. And again, both aimed at the same end. Four causes applied. So who are we in light of Thomas Aquinas' philosophy and theology? We would say that what is the goal of life? And interestingly, he would say the goal of life is to thrive according to your form. So a good tree is a tree that exhibits the form of tree well. It's not one with defective roots, because trees ought to have roots which sink deep and suck up water and do all these wonderful things. And a person, a good person, a happy person is one who's thriving according to what they are, their rational human nature. And he would argue that our goal of happiness is not something that we get just for ourselves, but instead that's something in community. He would say ultimately happiness is arranging the hierarchy of goods with the best things at the top, and then every less good thing in a proper hierarchy. And he pulls this from Aristotle, for example. Now, he says that we're happiest when we have this hierarchy correct. And again, recall from the fourth way that the greatest good is God himself. So he sees us as needing to put God at the very top of this hierarchy. God is our highest good. And then we share in God, the ultimate common good, as a community. So ultimately, he sees our happiness as our enjoyment of God, our creator, and our enjoyment of everybody else's enjoyment of their creator, all in community, returning praise back up to God. He sees our minds and our wills as giving us a freedom in order to arrange the hierarchy of goods in our lives and putting God first. And he sees that we have freedom precisely to pursue the good, so we can be real agents in pursuing the good, not just robots or this or that. He gives us a power of intellect and will that is truly in us to be able to pursue the good. And finally, he would say from his Christian context that we are all, when we are baptized into the role of prophet, priest, and king, and that's part of the way that we thrive. Now, and what does that mean? Well, what does a prophet do? A prophet teaches the faith. He proclaims the truth. What does a priest do? Well, he worships God. He's the one who's putting the highest things in the highest order. And what does a king do? Well, a king brings about a community. A king provides for his neighbor. A king actually defends things from that which is evil and establishes peace for those who pursue good. And finally, he sees, and I promise to get to the Trinity, and this one must be brief, unfortunately, he sees us imaging God. Now, we are not God. He would say that's entirely other. We're just contingent beings which are generated by God, but we have a tiny sliver of what it means to be like him and how. He would say that God is triune. Now recall that we had that soul, right? That one thing we could reflect on itself. Well, God is simple, and he is that type of divine mind, and he too can reflect on himself. but he can do it with absolute power, meaning he can hold in his mind, coming out of the substance of what he is, his pure existiness, if you will, he can hold himself in his mind perfectly, a perfect image done with all power. And that doesn't mean that he becomes two, there's one substance, but it means that there's now the perfect image of him, and now there's him. And what Aquinas would say is that the first one is the Father, eternally begetting the Son. And then, again, recall that God is perfect goodness. And goodness is addressed to one another. We see goodness, we want goodness, we love goodness. And when we see those perfections, it prompts in us love. And again, God is love. What is in him is him. So these two see one another, see each other's perfection and goodness. They respond in love, coming out of one another. And this dynamism inside of the one God, completely simple, of one substance, this third member is the Holy Spirit, the third member of the Trinity. Now, Aquinas thinks we actually image this in a number of ways, but he pulls from sacred scripture where it says, in the image of God, he created them. Man and woman, he created them. What does that mean? What shows in the early story of Genesis that there is man, and then out of man is pulled woman. So we have this being pulled out of, and yet they look at each other and they say, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. So they're unified in one nature, just like in the Trinity, we have God the Father, God the Son, unified in one nature, and yet one begetting out of the other. And yet they look at each other and they see the good of each other addressed to one another. And this, they respond in love, which brings them back into this unity, which creates another. And that is the begetting of other people. That is the fulfillment of go forth and multiply and fill the earth. So that's the way that he sees us, man and woman together, imaging the Trinity. Not that we are God, but that we can image him, that we can show God to one another in ourselves because we were made to be co-creators like he was, to bring, to arrange hierarchically goods like he did. So why are we spirit and matter? Because again, we learned from the slide on hylomorphism that we're both. Where is my spirit? It's here. Where is my body? It's here. So we are both. We are one substance. We are the rational human substance. Why? Why do we have to be made like this? Why can't we just be material like a rock or an animal? Why can't we be just immaterial like an angel or a number? Well, Aquinas would say that we inhabit an amazing role in all of creation. Because if you imagine one pyramid going this way, and we have all of matter, we have planets, we have stars, and then we have things which are alive, like plants and trees. And then on top of that, we have a few animals which can have actually motion, and they always have like an animal soul. And then on the very top, the very pinnacle of material creation is man. But imagine another pyramid coming down. And at the very top, we have like the great angelic beings, and then the lesser, and then all these immaterial things. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy of immaterial is man. So we are the very point where material touches the immaterial so that we can be the composite between the two. That's how we can fulfill our priestly role, our prophetic role, and our kingly role. So we are the priests of all creation because we are the only ones that with material eyes can see the material world, and with an immaterial mind can offer praise, understanding what God has done and understanding the good as good. Finally, he has a mystical moment at the very end of his life where he, praying before the crucifix speaks to him as God. And this is, of course, not written by him because he doesn't really self-promote at all, as we've learned earlier, but it's somebody else watching and heard a voice and went in and sees this. And God says, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What will you have as your reward?" And he says, "Non nisi te Domine." Nothing if not you, Lord. Now, that is the title of the talk. That is what shapes all of how he acts in the world. That's what shaped his philosophy of theology, his understanding of God, and his understanding and context of all creation. Non nisi te Domine. Nothing if not you, Lord. Now, think of the irony. What spoke to him? It was the crucifix. It was Christ on the crucifix. So Jesus, what was his reward? Non nisi te Domine. Nothing if not you, Lord. Not wealth, power, pleasure, honor. And that is what Thomas rejects in order to have the one thing that he cares about most. So at the end of this encounter, he says, everything I've written is like straw compared to this, where he actually saw God with the eyes of faith. He saw pure goodness, pure perfection. He was trying to get at it with those logical steps. And sure, yes, he did well. God affirms it. You have written well of me. What do you want as your reward? But he understands that the mystery of God goes far beyond anything that he could write. Sure, he wrote well, but it never gets to the totalitaire, all-itaire of God. Now, a mystery, he would say, is not a place to stop, it is a place to start. It's like if you had a gold mine and you were told that the vein of gold would never run out. Well, would you say, well, I guess I can't mine it all. I mean, I think I'll give up. No, that'd be ridiculous. That's the place you should mine because you'll never run out. That's what Aquinas would say about God, is we can mine this forever. We can always push further into our understanding of God. And this mystery isn't a place to stop, it's a place to start. It's a place to always push forward. And therefore, all of what he wrote is not and when he says it's straw, it's not a rejection of what he did, but it's a vindication of what his life was entirely about. So how did he do it? I would argue that his secret weapon was humility. Because what is humility but it's understanding oneself, and it's understanding oneself in context. And he understood himself in context of the other and in context of the total other, who is God. And because of that, seeing the greatness of God, he understood his own smallness. He's not God. God is entirely other than him. And yet he's directed in love towards God. So it's his humility that allows him to do this. It's the humility that allows him to learn. It's the humility that allows him to stand before people who could humiliate him and say, I don't care. I want to preach the truth. I want to help others praise God. I want to help those people who are ensnared by falsehoods find freedom, fulfilling my role as prophet, priest, and king. So what he ultimately looks for and what he sees as the ultimate happiness is beatitudo, the witness of God. And he does this by rejecting everything that's lesser. He thinks wealth is good. He thinks power is good, pleasure is good, and honor is good. But he sees these things as all less than beatitudo. He sees that you'll be unhappy if you put any of those things before beatitudo, the witness of God. And that's why non nisi te domine, nothing if not you, Lord. Because nothing can take the place of that which is in the highest place, which is God. And finally, he's able to have this penetrating understanding of all things philosophical, theological, in our place in the universe because he is pure of heart. Now, he's the same one who drives the prostitute out of that room. He's the same one who gives up on all these other earthly pleasures. He's not interested in becoming pope. He's not interested in becoming abbot. He would rather be a beggar if he thinks that it would serve God better. Finally, at the very end of his life, his best friend, Reginald, here's his confession. Aquinas is about to die. And in this confession, he tries to confess every single sin he can possibly remember. And again, his memory is prodigious, remembering entire books and passages of scripture. And he confesses everything with his humility, not caring about what this person thinks of him. And Reginald comes out in tears, saying, the sins of a little child. So although he was wise as a serpent, he was innocent as a dove. Although he had this penetrating understanding of God, sin was something foreign to him. When he sins like a little child, so that he can instead enjoy the beatitude of the witness of God, like somebody who is entirely grown up into the form that God intended. And finally, Aquinas describes in each of the 5 ways this great going out, this sending out from God in act, in necessity, contingency, and efficient causality, and finality, and all these ways. God is projected as sending out in love. But there's also something else going on. So that's just the beginning of the Summa. Aquinas spends much more time later on talking about the going back, because there's a dynamism internal to the Trinity of love, but there's also a dynamism inside of creation that God created. So what this is Aquinas sees this as in the person of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, that one who perfectly images the Father. He is sent into material creation. But his goal is to go the farthest from the Father. So he's taking the role of priest, right? He is both material and physical, but he is God, full and entire. And he's sent to the very limits of God forsakenness, which is where reality itself starts to fray. And that's what we would call sin, because sin is non-being where being ought to be. So that's where he finds himself. And then he calls back and returns. So that is the point at the cross where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's saying, I have found the very limits of God forsakenness. And now in his resurrection, he draws all things back to himself because we failed at the beginning as priests, bringing all of material up to God after he brought it all out in love to us. So the second Adam does what the first has failed, and that is why he goes all the way down into the earth of the grave, and he rises up in spirit with the full power of God to return all of creation to his Father. And that is what Aquinas sees as what we ought to do. We ought to join in Christ's one mission by joining into his one body. And that is what much of his theological understanding is all about. Now, covered many topics, but if you're still interested and you want to learn more, I'd point you to a few of these resources. One for podcasts, the Classical Theism podcast by John DeRosa, the Thomistic Institute podcast, which you'd imagine has much about Thomas Aquinas. And finally, Pints with Aquinas is a more popular level explanation of it. If you're looking for a website, I would suggest the ThomisticInstitute.org or Aquinas Online. If you'd like to read some authors, my very favorite on the subject of his philosophy will be Ed Feser. He has a number of excellent books, including one just called Aquinas, and another as Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide. And also Peter Kraft, who is a little bit more of a popular level author. Now, again, I understand you are all matter-informed, hylomorphic beings. So if you, as a total person, which is body and soul, want to go somewhere with your body and learn more, I would suggest the Thomas Aquinas Parish in Charlottesville, Virginia. Call them, email them, show up there, knock on their door. I'm sure they'd be happy to see you. Tell you more about the Catholic faith, which Thomas Aquinas shares, and Thomas Aquinas and his theology as a whole. Oh, and finally, if you want to know more about the biography of Thomas Aquinas, G.K. Chesterton wrote a book on him, and I would suggest that to learn more. All of his writing, G.K. Chesterton, is just like sparkles with joy and creativity. It sounds like a first draft with its just interest and bubbliness, and yet the writing is extraordinarily beautiful. In that respect, it sounds like something poured over for hours. And finally, if for some strange reason you want to ask me a question, you can email me at thegordianknot101@gmail.com. My name is Jake Buscher. And also, I invite you to see my site, thegordianknot.org. Okay. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate you hosting.
And that is why I say that this course of lectures is to give everyone the knowledge of God's creative processes, the means he employs, the balance which he demands, the separateness of father-motherhood into fathers and mothers, which must interchange in balance in order to unite and as one. And that applies to every corpuscle of the body as well as it applies to every individual entity as a whole.